The phone lit up for the 9th time, Catherine's name pulsing white against the dark screen, and Daniel Mercer watched it vibrate across the nightstand like something alive, something desperate, before he reached over and silenced it. He told himself he would call back. He always told himself that. 1 hour, maybe less, and he would step into the bathroom of the Raleigh Marriott, close the door, and return her call with the measured, exhausted voice of a man still trapped in a late meeting. He had become extraordinarily skilled at this particular performance over the past 6 months, the weary professional, the husband stretched thin by obligation, the father who wanted nothing more than to be home, but who carried the financial weight of a sick child's survival on his shoulders. It was a role he had rehearsed so thoroughly that there were moments, fleeting and disorienting, when he almost believed it himself. Sloane Ashby lay beside him in the king-sized bed, her auburn hair fanned across the white pillow, her breathing slow and content. She was 34, a marketing executive for a biotech startup based in Durham, and she possessed the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly broken by anything. Daniel had met her 7 months ago at a pharmaceutical industry conference in Atlanta. She had been sharp, funny, and entirely uninterested in his wedding ring, which somehow made her more magnetic. Their affair had begun with drinks, then dinners, then weekends constructed from elaborate lies. She knew about Catherine. She knew about Elijah, though only in the abstract way one knows about a colleague's family. Names without weight, facts without feeling. Daniel had made sure of that. He had built a wall between his two lives so complete that sometimes, lying in hotel rooms like this one, he could forget that the other world existed at all. But tonight the wall was thinner. Tonight something pressed against it. He picked up the phone and saw the notifications stacking like a column of small emergencies. 9 missed calls from Catherine, 2 from his mother-in-law Diane, 1 from a number he recognized as belonging to Duke University Medical Center. His stomach tightened, a reflexive clench he immediately suppressed. Elijah had been in and out of the hospital so many times over the past 18 months that the sight of that number had lost its power to shock. There had been the initial diagnosis, juvenile dermatomyositis, complicated by a secondary autoimmune response that attacked his kidneys and liver with a ferocity that baffled even the specialists. There had been the first hospitalization, the second, the 5th, the experimental drug protocol, the cautious optimism followed by the devastating setbacks. Daniel had been present for some of it. He had held his son's hand during the early infusions, had carried him to the car after appointments, had sat in Dr. Pratt's office, nodding gravely while the physician explained T-cell counts and immunosuppressive therapies in language designed to sound hopeful while conveying very little hope at all. But presence had become harder. Not because of logistics. Daniel controlled his own schedule with the authority of a senior partner at Whitfield Crane Consulting, one of the Southeast's most prestigious pharmaceutical advisory firms. He could have been there for every appointment, every crisis, every long night in the pediatric ward. The truth, the one he buried beneath layers of rationalization so thick they had become structural, was that he could not bear to watch his son disappear. Elijah at 5 had been a miracle of energy, a boy who collected rocks and named them, who laughed with his entire body, who crawled into Daniel's lap on Sunday mornings and fell asleep with his small fingers curled around his father's thumb. Elijah at 7 was a ghost of that child, 43 pounds, skin so pale it seemed translucent, eyes that had grown enormous in his shrinking face, eyes that still looked at Daniel with a trust so absolute it felt like an indictment. Daniel had responded to this slow devastation the way he responded to every problem in his professional life. He threw resources at it. He ensured Elijah had the best specialists, the most advanced treatments, a private room at Duke with a view of the gardens. He paid for everything without complaint. The medical bills that had climbed past $400,000, the home modifications, the specialized nutrition plans, the round-the-clock care that Catherine managed with a competence born of desperation. He told himself this was love. He told himself that providing was a form of presence. And when the weight of his son's suffering became too much to carry in his chest, he found Sloane, and he set the weight down, and he breathed. The phone lit up again, the 10th call. Sloane stirred beside him, her eyes opening halfway. She made a soft, questioning sound, and Daniel shook his head, a gesture meant to convey that it was nothing, just work, just the usual demands of a life she had agreed to share only in fragments. She accepted this and closed her eyes again. That was one of the things he valued about Sloane. She did not ask questions she did not want answered. Their arrangement was built on a mutual agreement to occupy only the present tense. No past, no future, no 7-year-old boy in a hospital bed 60 miles away whose kidneys were, at that very moment, shutting down. At Duke University Medical Center, Catherine Mercer stood in a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and fear, her phone pressed to her ear, listening to the sound of her husband's voicemail greeting for the 10th consecutive time. His voice on the recording was calm, professional, almost cheerful, the voice of a man who existed in a world where things functioned as they should. She ended the call without leaving another message. She had already left 3. The first had been urgent but controlled. The second had been pleading. The third had dissolved into sounds that were not quite words. She turned back toward the pediatric intensive care unit, where Elijah lay in a bed that seemed to swallow him. The crisis had come without warning, or rather, with warnings that had been building for weeks. Warnings she had communicated to Daniel in texts he acknowledged with brief, distracted replies. Elijah's lab work had been deteriorating. His creatinine levels had spiked. Dr. Pratt had adjusted the protocol again, adding a new medication Catherine hadn't fully understood. And she had trusted him, because trusting him was the only alternative to the unthinkable. But tonight, at approximately 8:30 in the evening, Elijah had begun vomiting blood. His small body had convulsed on the bathroom floor of their home in Myers Park, while Catherine screamed into the phone at the 911 dispatcher, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold him still. The ambulance had delivered them to Duke in 22 minutes. By the time they arrived, Elijah was barely conscious. His blood pressure was dropping. The attending nephrologist, a woman Catherine had never met before, explained in rapid, clinical terms that both kidneys were in acute failure, and that the underlying autoimmune cascade appeared to have accelerated beyond what the current treatment could manage. They were initiating emergency dialysis. They were calling in the full team. Catherine had nodded, understanding and not understanding, her mind splitting into 2 parallel tracks, one that processed medical information with the precision of her nursing training, and one that simply screamed. She called Daniel again. 11. Her mother arrived at 9:45, having driven from Greensboro in what must have been record time. Diane Calloway was 63, a retired school teacher with a spine of iron and a face that could communicate devastation without moving a single muscle. She found her daughter in the PICU waiting area, still in the clothes she had been wearing when Elijah collapsed, a gray sweater stained with her son's blood, yoga pants, bare feet shoved into the first shoes she had found by the door. Diane held her. Catherine did not cry. She was beyond crying. She was in the territory past tears, the dry, airless place where the body conserves every resource for the single task of enduring. They let her sit with him. The dialysis machine hummed beside the bed, doing the work his kidneys could no longer perform. And Catherine held Elijah's hand, so small, the fingers cool, the nails tinged blue, and talked to him. She told him about the garden they would plant in the spring, the tomatoes and sunflowers he had chosen from the seed catalog. She told him about the dog they had been discussing, the golden retriever he wanted to name Captain. She told him his father was coming. She told him that over and over, as if repetition could make it true. In the Raleigh Marriott, Daniel Mercer poured himself a glass of water from the bathroom tap and stared at his reflection. 42 years old, graying at the temples in a way that clients called distinguished, broad-shouldered, well-dressed even in his undershirt, carrying the physical assurance of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. He had grown up in modest circumstances in Fayetteville, the son of a military logistics officer and a dental hygienist, and he had clawed his way to the top of his profession through intelligence, charm, and an almost pathological refusal to accept limitation. Whitfield Crane had made him partner at 36. He earned $780,000 a year. He owned a home worth $2.1 million in one of Charlotte's most coveted neighborhoods. He had a beautiful wife, a beautiful life, and a dying son he could not save. And so he had found a woman who made him feel, for a few hours at a time, like none of it was happening. He checked the time, 11:20. He would call Catherine at midnight, he decided. He would tell her he had been in a dead zone, that his phone had died, that he was driving back from a client dinner in Raleigh and had only just seen her messages. The lies assembled themselves automatically, like a machine he had built and could no longer shut off. He returned to bed. Sloane murmured something about breakfast in the morning. He said that sounded nice. He closed his eyes. At 11:41, Elijah's heart rate began to drop. The monitors shifted from their steady electronic rhythm to something irregular, urgent, alarming. Catherine was beside him instantly, gripping his hand, calling his name. The medical team responded with practiced speed. A crash cart appeared. Voices overlapped. Someone guided Catherine backward with firm hands while she fought against them. Not violently, but with the desperate, instinctive resistance of a mother being separated from her child. She could see them working on him. She could see the compressions, the injections, the controlled urgency that masked what everyone in the room already understood. At 11:47 on the night of January 28, 2026, Elijah Daniel Mercer was pronounced dead. He was 7 years old. He weighed 41 pounds. He was wearing pajamas printed with small blue rockets that Catherine had packed in his hospital bag because they were his favorites, because he said they made him feel like he could fly. Catherine did not scream. She walked to the bed where her son lay, now still, now absent in the most fundamental and irreversible way a person can be absent, and she lay down beside him. She pressed her face against his hair, which smelled of hospital shampoo, and something underneath that was simply, irreducibly him. And she held him, the way she had held him on the day he was born, curled around him, sheltering him with her body from a world that had, in the end, been too much for his. The nurses did not ask her to move. They dimmed the lights and left the room, and Diane stood in the doorway, with tears running silently down her face, and the only sound was Catherine's breathing, ragged and broken, and the absence of the monitors, which someone had mercifully turned off. At 12:15, Diane picked up Catherine's phone and sent a text message to Daniel. She typed it with steady hands and a fury she would carry for the rest of her life. The message read simply, "Elijah is gone. Where are you?" At 1:15 in the morning, Daniel Mercer woke to use the bathroom and glanced at his phone out of habit. The screen was dense with notifications, 17 missed calls, 6 voicemails, 4 text messages. His chest constricted before his conscious mind could process why. He opened the text first. He read Diane's message. He read it again. The words did not change. They sat on the screen with the permanence of something carved into stone. And the hotel room, which moments ago had been a refuge, became the scene of his annihilation. He played the voicemail from Catherine. It was the third one, the one that had devolved past language. He heard his wife weeping in a way he had never heard another human being weep. A sound that came from somewhere beneath consciousness, beneath identity, from the raw, animal core of a mother whose child has died. The voicemail lasted 47 seconds. He listened to every one of them. Then he sat on the edge of the hotel bed, the phone in his hand, and the architecture of his carefully constructed double life collapsed inward like a building whose foundation had been removed. Sloane woke. She saw his posture, rigid, bent, a man folding in on himself, and she sat up, reaching for his shoulder, asking what was wrong. Her voice was gentle, concerned, entirely inadequate to the magnitude of what had occurred. Daniel opened his mouth to speak. No sound came. He tried again. Nothing. The words that existed for this, "My son is dead. I was here. I was here while he died," were words that, once spoken aloud, would make everything real and permanent and unforgeable. So he sat in silence, the phone glowing in his hand, Sloane's fingers on his shoulder, and the distance between the man he had pretended to be and the man he actually was closed to zero. And what remained was not a person, but a void, a hollow space in the shape of a father who had not been there for the only moment that would ever matter. The house smelled like lilies, and Daniel Mercer would never be able to encounter that scent again without feeling his stomach lurch toward his throat. They had arrived in waves during the first 48 hours. Arrangements from neighbors, from Catherine's friends at the church she attended without him, from his colleagues at Whitfield Crane, who expressed their condolences through expensive floral displays and carefully worded cards that said nothing of substance. The lilies dominated. They sat on the kitchen counter, on the dining room table, on the console in the entryway, where Elijah's small shoes still rested in a row, 3 pairs arranged by size, the Velcro straps of his sneakers still pressed down from the last time his fingers had closed them. Daniel walked past those shoes every time he entered the house, and every time The sight of them delivered a blow so precise and so total that he had to stop moving and simply stand, breathing, waiting for the capacity to function to return. He had driven home from Raleigh in the dark, arriving at 3:40 in the morning to a house that was empty because Catherine was still at the hospital, still lying beside their son's body, refusing to leave until someone with sufficient authority and sufficient gentleness convinced her that she must. Daniel had stood in the kitchen, his car keys still in his hand, and looked at the evidence of the evening's catastrophe. The bathroom where Elijah had collapsed, the floor still bearing faint traces of blood that Catherine had not had time to clean, the phone charger dangling from the wall where she had ripped it free in her haste. He had cleaned the bathroom floor on his hands and knees at 4 in the morning, scrubbing with a methodical, mechanical intensity that was not grief, but its precursor, the body performing tasks while the mind refused to arrive at the place where feeling waited. Catherine came home at noon the following day, delivered by her mother, and when she walked through the door and saw Daniel standing in the living room, something passed across her face that he would spend the rest of his life trying to interpret. It was not anger, not yet. It was something more searching than anger, a look of profound, almost clinical assessment, as though she were examining him for evidence of the man she had married and finding the results inconclusive. She did not ask where he had been, not then. She walked past him and up the stairs to Elijah's room, and she closed the door, and Daniel heard nothing from behind it for 3 hours. The funeral was held on a Saturday, 5 days after Elijah's death, at Myers Park Presbyterian Church, a stone edifice that seated 800 and was nearly full. Daniel had not expected so many people. He had underestimated, or perhaps never fully understood, the breadth of the community that had formed around his son's illness. The parents from Elijah's school who had organized meal trains, the nurses from Duke who had grown attached to the boy with the rocket pajamas, the neighbors who had watched Catherine carry him to the car for appointments and had felt, in witnessing her devotion, something that compelled their own. They came in dark clothes with wet eyes, and they filled the pews, and they looked at Daniel with an empathy so earnest it made him want to crawl out of his own skin. He delivered the eulogy because it was expected of him, because he was Daniel Mercer, and Daniel Mercer performed well under pressure, and because some part of him believed that if he could find the right words, he could construct a version of fatherhood that might, retroactively, become true. He stood at the pulpit in a charcoal suit and spoke about Elijah's laugh, which had been enormous and uncontainable, a sound too large for his small body. He spoke about the rocks Elijah collected and named, Gerald, Professor Bumble, King Flat, and how each one sat in a row on his windowsill, a parliament of stones governing an imaginary kingdom. He spoke about courage, about how his son had endured needles and machines and long hospital nights with a patience that shamed every adult in the room. His voice broke at precisely the right moments. Tears came to his eyes at precisely the right intervals. The congregation wept. Catherine, seated in the front pew beside her mother, stared straight ahead with a face so still it might have been carved from marble. Daniel knew, with the cold clarity of a man whose profession required him to read rooms and manipulate outcomes, that he was performing. He was delivering a presentation. The grief was real. It lived in him like a second skeleton, a structure of pain beneath the structure of bone. but the expression of it was curated, managed, optimized for impact. He hated himself for this awareness. He hated that even in the deepest moment of his life, the machinery of his ambition and his charm could not be shut off. He returned to the pew and sat beside Catherine, and when he reached for her hand, she did not pull away, but her fingers remained limp in his, offering nothing. The drinking began on the third night after the funeral. Bourbon initially, a bottle of Woodford Reserve that had been sitting in the study for months, a gift from a client he could no longer remember. He poured 2 fingers, then 4, then stopped measuring. The alcohol did not numb the guilt so much as reorganize it, spreading it from a concentrated point in his chest to a diffuse ache that occupied his entire body, which was, if not better, at least different. He drank in the study with the door closed, surrounded by framed photographs he could not look at and books he could not read. And he replayed the night of January 28th in an endless, excruciating loop. The phone lighting up, his hand reaching over, the deliberate, conscious decision to silence it. He had chosen. That was the thing he could not escape, the thing the bourbon could not dissolve. He had not missed the calls through accident or circumstance. He had seen his wife's name, and he had chosen not to answer. And in the space of that choice, his son had died without his father's voice in his ear, without the knowledge that his father was coming, without the comfort that Daniel could have provided and did not. The flashbacks came without warning and without mercy. He would be standing at the kitchen sink, and suddenly he was in Elijah's room 2 years ago, reading a bedtime story about a bear who lost his hat. And Elijah was laughing at the illustrations, and Daniel's phone buzzed with a message from Sloan. And he told Elijah he needed to finish the story tomorrow. And the look on his son's face, not disappointment, something worse, something like resignation, the look of a child who has learned not to expect presents, would slam into Daniel with the force of a physical blow. He would grip the edge of the counter and breathe and wait for the memory to release him, and when it did, he would pour another drink. There were other memories, sharper still. The Saturday morning he had told Catherine he was going to the office, but had driven to Durham to meet Sloan for brunch. And when he returned, Elijah had made him a card with crayon drawings of the 2 of them holding hands under a yellow sun, and across the top in shaky, enormous letters the words, "My dad is the best." Daniel had put the card on the refrigerator and felt nothing. He felt it now. He felt it with a totality that threatened to unmake him. Catherine existed in a parallel devastation. She moved through the house like a woman walking through deep water, every motion slowed, every task requiring an effort that seemed to consume her entirely. She did not eat unless her mother placed food in front of her. She did not sleep so much as lose consciousness for brief, fitful intervals, waking each time with a gasp, reaching for a child who was not there. But beneath the grief, beneath the fog of loss that had settled over her like a physical weight, something else was stirring. A question. A series of questions, actually, that had begun as whispers and were growing louder with each passing day. It started with the medical records. Catherine, in her former life as a registered nurse, had maintained meticulous files on Elijah's treatment, binders organized by date, containing lab results, medication lists, physician notes, and her own observations written in the precise clinical shorthand she had never fully abandoned. In the second week after the funeral, unable to sleep and unwilling to simply lie in the dark with her thoughts, she pulled the binders from the shelf in the study and began reviewing them. She was not looking for anything specific. She was looking for her son, for the narrative of his illness told in numbers and dosages, for some thread of logic that might explain why a 7-year-old boy who had been responding to treatment 3 months ago was now in the ground. What she found instead were inconsistencies. Small ones at first, a dosage change in October that she had not been informed about until a follow-up appointment in November, documented in Dr. Pratt's notes as having been discussed with the family when Catherine was certain no such discussion had taken place. A switch from the original experimental compound to a modified formulation in September, noted in the pharmacy records but absent from the consent forms she had signed. A lab result from early January showing elevated liver enzymes that should have triggered an immediate protocol review, but appeared to have been filed without action. And then there was Andrea Voss. Catherine remembered her, a nurse practitioner on Dr. Pratt's team, a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and a habit of lingering after appointments as though she wanted to say something more. In December, during one of Elijah's infusion sessions, Andrea had sat beside Catherine in the treatment room and asked, in a voice carefully calibrated to sound casual, whether Catherine had noticed any new symptoms since the medication change. Catherine had described the increased fatigue, the nausea, the bruising that appeared without cause. Andrea had written something in her notebook and then looked at Catherine with an expression that Catherine, at the time, had interpreted as professional concern, but now, in retrospect, recognized as something closer to alarm. Andrea had not been present at any appointment after that. When Catherine asked, she was told Andrea had transferred to another department. Catherine brought her findings to Daniel on a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks after the funeral. She laid the binders on the kitchen table and walked him through the discrepancies with the methodical precision of a woman who had spent years reading charts and understanding what the numbers meant. Daniel listened. He listened with an attention he had not given anything in months, perhaps years, because what Catherine was describing offered him something he desperately needed, a target for the fury that was consuming him from the inside. He began making calls the next morning. His first was to Dr. Leonard Pratt's office at Duke, requesting a meeting to discuss Elijah's treatment records. The receptionist was polite, but evasive, explaining that Dr. Pratt's schedule was fully committed for the next several weeks. Daniel called again, identifying himself not as a grieving father, but as a senior partner at Whitfield Crane Consulting, with extensive contacts in pharmaceutical regulation. The meeting was scheduled for Friday. When it occurred, Dr. Pratt was cordial, sympathetic, and utterly impenetrable, expressing sorrow for Elijah's passing while deflecting every specific question about dosage changes and protocol modifications with references to clinical complexity and the inherent unpredictability of experimental treatments. Daniel left the meeting knowing, with the instinct of a man who had spent 2 decades navigating corporate deception, that Pratt was hiding something. That evening, Daniel sat in his study and pulled up everything he could find on the experimental drug Elijah had been taking, a compound called MK4187, manufactured by Kessler Brandt Pharmaceuticals, a mid-cap firm based in New Jersey that had been aggressively expanding its pediatric immunology portfolio. Daniel knew Kessler Brandt, not intimately, but professionally. Whitfield Crane had consulted for them 2 years ago on a market access strategy for a different product line. Daniel himself had attended a preliminary meeting. He had shaken hands with their executives. He had, in the most indirect and yet undeniable sense, been part of the machinery that supported the company now at the center of his son's treatment. The realization settled over him like ice water. He poured a bourbon. He did not drink it. He stared at the glass and felt something shift inside him, a tectonic movement beneath the surface of his grief. And what rose from the fissure was not sorrow, but rage, cold, focused, and utterly without mercy. 3 days later, Sloane called. Her name appeared on his phone screen, and for a moment he simply stared at it, unable to connect the woman it represented with the man he had become. She had been texting intermittently since the night of Elijah's death, messages that progressed from confused to concerned to plaintive, each one a reminder of the life he had been living while his son's life ended. He answered. He told her it was over, in a voice so flat and devoid of emotion that she initially thought the call had disconnected. She asked what had happened. He told her his son was dead. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that he could hear her breathing change. She began to say she was sorry, and he ended the call before the sentence was complete. He deleted her contact. He deleted the text thread, but he had not been thorough enough. Catherine, who had taken to picking up his phone with the vigilance of a woman whose instincts had been whispering to her for months, found a single message that had arrived before the deletion. 2 words from an unsaved number that nonetheless communicated everything. I miss you. Catherine did not confront him with tears. She did not confront him with shouting. She walked into the study where he sat surrounded by medical records and pharmaceutical filings, and she placed his phone on the desk in front of him with the message displayed. And she stood there in silence until he looked up. The expression on her face was one of absolute, crystalline understanding, the final piece of a puzzle she had been assembling without knowing it. The answer to the question of where he had been on the night their son died. She did not need him to confirm it. His face confirmed it. The way his eyes dropped, the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands went still on the papers before him. Every micro expression was a confession. She told him she wanted a separation. She said it calmly, with the exhausted clarity of a woman who had already lost the thing that mattered most and therefore had nothing left to fear. Daniel did not argue. He did not explain. He did not beg. He understood, with a completeness that left no room for self-pity, that he had forfeited every right to contest her decision on a night in January when he silenced his phone and turned back to a woman who was not his wife, while his son's heart slowed and stopped. He packed a single suitcase. He took nothing from Elijah's room. He rented an apartment downtown, a sterile 1-bedroom on the 14th floor of a building filled with young professionals and divorced men. And he set the suitcase on the bed and stood at the window looking out at the Charlotte skyline. And he felt the last remnants of the life he had built fall away like scaffolding from a structure that had never been sound. What remained was the investigation. What remained was Kessler Brandt and Dr. Pratt, and the missing nurse named Andrea Voss, and a trail of suppressed data that led, he was increasingly certain, to the reason his son was dead. Daniel sat at the small desk in his new apartment and opened his laptop and began to work with the focused, relentless intensity of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything left to destroy. The guilt did not diminish. It would never diminish. But beside it now burned something else, a fury so precise and so patient that it frightened even him. He had failed his son in life. He would not fail him in this. Marcus Cole had the kind of face that made people forget he was in the room, and he had built an entire career on that advantage. Daniel found him through a former colleague at Whitfield Crane, a man named Patterson, who had once needed someone to quietly investigate a competitor's patent filings and had described Cole as the most thorough and morally indifferent researcher he had ever encountered. Cole was 51, a former FBI analyst who had spent 14 years in the Bureau's white-collar crime division before leaving under circumstances he described only as a difference in philosophy. He operated from a small office in Alexandria, Virginia, furnished with nothing but a desk, 2 monitors, and a coffee maker that appeared to run continuously. When Daniel sat across from him in early March and laid out what he knew about Kessler Brandt, about MK4187, about the dosage changes and the missing nurse and the evasive physician, Cole listened without interrupting, without taking notes, without any visible reaction at all. When Daniel finished, Cole asked a single question. He wanted to know whether Daniel was prepared for what they might find, not just about the company, but about himself and his own firm's involvement. Daniel said he was. Cole studied him for a long moment, then nodded and quoted his fee, which was substantial, and Daniel paid it without hesitation. The investigation began with the clinical trial records. Cole had contacts at the FDA, former colleagues who owed him favors or feared what he knew about them, and within 2 weeks, he had obtained the original investigational new drug application for MK4187, along with the interim safety reports that Kessler Brandt had submitted during the Phase 2 and Phase 3 trials. The compound was an immunomodulator designed to target the specific autoimmune cascade responsible for conditions like Elijah's, and on paper, it had shown remarkable promise. The Phase 2 data demonstrated significant improvement in 63% of pediatric patients with manageable side effects that fell within acceptable parameters. It was this data that had convinced Dr. Pratt to enroll Elijah in the expanded access program, and it was this data that Catherine had been shown when she signed the consent forms. But Cole found the other data, the data that had not been submitted. Buried within Kessler Brandt's internal research files, which Cole obtained through a source he declined to identify, was a supplemental analysis conducted by the company's own biostatistics team in July of the previous year. The analysis examined a subset of patients, specifically children under 10 with compromised renal function at baseline, and found that MK4187 produced a paradoxical effect in this population. Rather than modulating the immune response, the drug appeared to accelerate it, triggering a cascade of organ inflammation that progressed to failure in a time frame far shorter than the natural course of the disease. The analysis identified 11 patients across 3 trial sites who exhibited this pattern. 7 of them had died. The remaining 4 had been withdrawn from the trial after developing acute kidney failure, the same condition that had killed Elijah. The supplemental analysis had been flagged by the biostatistics team leader, a researcher named Dr. Young Hee Park, with a recommendation for immediate disclosure to the FDA and suspension of enrollment for the at-risk subgroup. The recommendation had been reviewed by Kessler Brandt's chief medical officer, who forwarded it to the executive leadership team, and there it had stopped. No disclosure was made, no enrollment was suspended. The analysis was reclassified as preliminary and inconclusive, and Dr. Park was reassigned to a different project. The trial continued. The FDA approval process, which Kessler Brandt's investor communications valued at $2.3 billion in projected first-year revenue, proceeded without interruption. Daniel received this information on a Thursday evening in late March, sitting in his downtown apartment with the documents spread across the kitchen table and Cole's voice on speakerphone, methodical and uninflected, walking him through each finding with the precision of a man presenting evidence to a grand jury. Daniel listened and felt the room contract around him, the walls pressing inward, the air thinning. His son had been in the at-risk subgroup. His son had exhibited every marker the biostatistics team had identified. His son had been enrolled in a trial that the manufacturer knew with documented certainty was killing children like him, and they had allowed it to continue because the financial consequences of stopping were unacceptable to their shareholders. He did not break anything. He did not shout. He sat very still at the kitchen table and felt the rage crystallize inside him, hardening from something hot and chaotic into something cold and geometric, a structure with edges and purpose. When Cole finished speaking, Daniel asked about Dr. Pratt. Cole told him what he had found. Dr. Leonard Pratt had received $342,000 from Kessler Brandt over the preceding 2 years, dispersed through a combination of research grants, consulting fees, and speaking honoraria. The payments were technically legal, disclosed in the Open Payments Database as required by the Sunshine Act. But their timing was damning. The largest single payment, a research grant of $150,000, had been issued 6 weeks after the suppressed biostatistics analysis was completed, at precisely the moment when Kessler Brandt needed its trial investigators to remain compliant and unquestioning. Pratt had continued enrolling patients. He had continued adjusting dosages in ways that were consistent with keeping subjects in the trial rather than protecting their safety. He had switched Elijah from the original formulation to the modified version, a change that the internal documents revealed was designed not to improve efficacy, but to mask the biomarkers of organ inflammation that would otherwise have triggered mandatory reporting. Pratt had known. Perhaps not everything, but enough. He had known enough, and he had continued. And Elijah had paid for that decision with his life. In April, Daniel found Andrea Voss. Cole traced her to a small apartment in Roanoke, Virginia, where she had relocated after leaving Duke. She was working part-time at a community health clinic, a significant step down from her previous position, and when Daniel called her, the silence on the other end was so long, he thought she had hung up. She had not. She was deciding whether to trust him. He told her who he was. He told her about Elijah. He told her he had the internal documents. And then he waited. She agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near the clinic, a small, unremarkable place with wooden tables and the smell of burnt espresso. Daniel arrived early and sat facing the door. And when Andrea walked in, he recognized her immediately from the description Catherine had given. A woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and the cautious posture of someone who had been punished for doing the right thing. She sat across from him and folded her hands on the table and looked at him with an expression of such profound, weary sorrow that Daniel understood, before she said a single word, that she had been carrying this weight alone for months. Andrea confirmed everything. She had noticed the pattern in October when 2 patients on her caseload, including Elijah, began showing signs of accelerated renal decline that did not match the expected disease trajectory. She had raised her concerns with Dr. Pratt, who had dismissed them as within normal variability. She had persisted. She had pulled the pharmacy records and discovered the formulation switch. She had filed an internal complaint with Duke's Institutional Review Board. Within a week, she was informed that her position was being eliminated due to departmental restructuring. She was offered a modest severance package contingent on signing a non-disclosure agreement. She had signed it because she was a single mother with a daughter in college and no savings to sustain a legal fight. But she had kept copies of everything she had filed. She had kept them in a fireproof safe in her closet, waiting for someone to come asking. She gave Daniel the copies. Her hands trembled as she slid the folder across the table, and tears ran down her face, and she told him she was sorry. That she had tried to warn Catherine during that December appointment, that she had wanted to say more, but had been afraid. Daniel took the folder and told her that what she had done, what she was doing now, mattered more than she knew. He did not tell her that he was also a man who had failed to be present when it mattered, that his authority to judge anyone's moral courage was non-existent. That was his burden, not hers. By May, Daniel had assembled a case so comprehensive and so damning that he could have taken it to any plaintiff's attorney in the country and triggered a lawsuit that would have consumed Kessler Brandt for a decade. But he had spent 20 years inside the pharmaceutical industry. He knew how these cases ended. They ended in settlements, in sealed documents, in confidentiality agreements that bought silence with money. They ended with executives retaining their positions and their wealth, while families received checks that were supposed to represent the value of a child's life. The legal system would process Elijah's death the way it processed everything, slowly, procedurally, with outcomes calibrated to minimize institutional disruption rather than to deliver justice. Daniel wanted something different. He wanted destruction. He began with the press. Through a contact at Whitfield Crane who had moved into journalism, he secured introductions to investigative reporters at the Washington Post and ProPublica, both of whom had been tracking concerns about accelerated FDA approvals in pediatric medicine. Daniel provided them with the suppressed biostatistics analysis, the internal communications showing executive knowledge, the payment records linking Kessler Brandt to Dr. Pratt, and Andrea Voss's institutional complaint. He provided everything anonymously at first, then on the record, using his own name, his own credentials, his own professional reputation as currency. The stories broke in the second week of May, 48 hours apart, and the effect was seismic. The FDA announced an immediate review of MK4187. Kessler Brandt's stock price dropped 31% in a single trading day. Congressional inquiries were initiated. The Department of Justice opened a preliminary investigation. But Daniel was not finished. He understood Kessler Brandt's business architecture with the intimacy of a man who had helped build similar structures for similar companies. He knew which partnerships were fragile, which distribution agreements contained morality clauses, which institutional investors had public commitments to ethical governance that could be weaponized. He fed information to competitors who had been seeking leverage. He contacted regulatory bodies in Europe and Canada, where Kessler Brandt had pending applications. He dismantled the company's strategic position with the same methodical precision he had once used to build such positions for his clients, turning every skill he possessed, every relationship he had cultivated, every piece of insider knowledge he carried into instruments of calculated ruin. Dr. Pratt's medical license came under review by the North Carolina Medical Board in late May, triggered by the institutional complaint Andrea Voss had filed and the corroborating evidence Daniel had provided. Pratt retained an attorney and issued a statement expressing confidence in his clinical decisions. But Daniel had seen the man's face in the days after the Post story broke, captured in a photograph outside Duke's administrative building, and the confidence was gone. What remained was the hollow, hunted expression of a man who understood that the architecture of his professional life was collapsing, and that no amount of legal maneuvering would rebuild it. The charity gala was held on the last Saturday of May at the Willard Intercontinental in Washington, D.C., a black tie affair benefiting pediatric cancer research that attracted the upper echelon of the pharmaceutical industry. Richard Hale, the CEO of Kessler Brandt, was in attendance despite having been subpoenaed by a congressional committee 3 days earlier. Daniel knew he would be there. Daniel had purchased a ticket for $4,000 and had dressed in his finest suit and had walked into the ballroom with the calm, purposeful stride of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind every night for 3 months. He found Hale near the bar, surrounded by associates who formed a protective constellation around their embattled leader. Daniel approached without hesitation. He introduced himself by name, and he watched the recognition register on Hale's face, the flicker of alarm quickly suppressed beneath a mask of corporate composure. Hale extended his hand. Daniel did not take it. Instead, in a voice pitched to carry just far enough to reach the dozen people standing within earshot, Daniel told Richard Hale exactly who Elijah was. He described his son's laugh. He described the rocket pajamas. He described the weight of a 7-year-old boy's body in a hospital bed. 41 pounds, kept alive by machines, while a company that knew its drug was killing him allowed the trial to continue because the alternative was a $2.3 billion write-off. He described what it sounded like when the mother wept over her dead child's body, a sound he had heard on a voicemail because he had not been there in person, a failure he owned completely, but that did not diminish by one fraction the magnitude of what Hale and his company had done. He told Hale that every person in this room would know what he had chosen, that every regulator and every journalist and every parent who had trusted Kessler Brandt with their child's life would know, and that no settlement, no legal strategy, no amount of philanthropic performance would ever wash it clean. Hale said nothing. His face had gone the color of ash. The people around him stood frozen, drinks in hand, witnesses to a reckoning they had not anticipated and could not look away from. Daniel held Hale's gaze for a long, silent moment, then turned and walked out of the ballroom and into the Washington night, and he did not look back. Catherine watched all of it from a distance. She followed the news coverage, read the articles, saw Daniel's name quoted as the father who had exposed the scandal. She felt things she could not reconcile, a gratitude so fierce it ached, alongside a revulsion she could not suppress. He was fighting for Elijah with a ferocity that honored their son's memory, and he was doing it with the same ruthlessness and capacity for strategic manipulation that had allowed him to maintain a 6-month affair while their child was dying. The tools were the same, only the target had changed. She did not call him. She did not tell him she was proud. She was not sure she was. But she watched, and she understood that whatever Daniel was becoming in the crucible of this campaign, it was something that could not have existed without both his love and his guilt, fused together into an alloy harder than either one alone. On the last evening of May, Daniel drove to the cemetery alone. The light was failing, the sky streaked with amber and violet, and the grass around Elijah's headstone had grown thick and green with the spring. The stone was small, white marble, engraved with his son's name and the dates that bookended a life of 7 years and 4 months. Someone had left flowers, fresh ones, and Daniel knew they were from Catherine because she came every Sunday, and because the arrangement included sunflowers, which Elijah had planned to grow in their garden. Daniel knelt beside the grave. He did not pray. He had never been a man of faith, and he did not intend to become one now through the convenience of desperation. He did not ask for forgiveness. He knew, with an honesty that had been scoured clean of every comforting illusion, that he did not deserve it. He had been in a hotel room with another woman while his son died. No amount of justice delivered afterward could alter that fact. It was the permanent, immovable center of his existence, the truth around which everything else would orbit for the rest of his life. But he spoke to Elijah. He whispered to his son that every person who had played a role in his death had faced or would face the consequences. He told him about the investigation, the articles, the federal inquiry, the medical board review. He told him that Kessler Brandt was crumbling and that Richard Hale would answer for what he had done. He told him these things not because a 7-year-old boy buried in the earth could hear them, but because saying them aloud made them into promises. And Daniel Mercer, for all his failures, had never broken a promise he made with his full intent behind it. He stood. He placed his hand on the top of the headstone, feeling the cool marble beneath his palm. And he stayed like that for a long time, a silhouette against the fading sky, a man hollowed out by loss and guilt, who had turned his worst qualities, his ruthlessness, his ambition, his capacity for deception, into weapons of justice. Then he walked away, across the green grass, past the rows of stones, toward the parking lot where his car waited to carry him back to his empty apartment and the work that remained. He had been absent for the moment that mattered most. He would be present for every moment of reckoning that followed.